In this demonstration, we're going to talk about configuring Active Directory sites. Active Directory sites allow us to kind of create a mirror of our geographical network topology. And by doing this, we can control what traffic goes where as far as Active Directory is concerned. Now, in order to manage sites, we need to use the Active Directory Sites and Services console. I'll select it from my Tools menu on my domain controller here. Now, as I said, you need to configure sites to mirror the geographical locations that are used by your organization. If I come over here and expand sites on the left, we should see that we actually have one default site already created. It was created when I first installed Active Directory. Now, since Active Directory doesn't actually know where my organization is physically located, it named the default site default first site name. That's pretty helpful, isn't it? What we need to do is go in and change this default first site name to match your first geographic location. Let's say, for example, that my organization's headquarters are in New York City. I would right-click on my default first site name and then click on Rename and change it to NYC, for example. Now I've got a site defined for New York City for my organization. Now be aware that by default, all of my existing domain controllers in my Active Directory tree are going to be located inside of this default site. If I expand it and then go to servers, I see my DC4 domain controller, that's the one I'm working on right here, as well as my DC6 domain controller. Because Active Directory didn't know where to put them, it just dumped them into the default first site. Now I will point out that when you are adding a domain controller to an existing domain, this was my first domain controller here, DC4. I added the DC6 domain controller later. You'll see that there is an option to specify which site you want to put that domain controller in. At the time I installed DC6, however, I didn't have any extra sites. I only had the one, so that's where it had to go. So a best practice is to install your first domain controller, set up all of your sites and your links, and then when you install your additional domain controllers, put them in the appropriate site during the installation process. It's not a big deal if you don't do it that way. You can always come back in like we're going to do here and move them around where they need to go. Now in this scenario, let's suppose that we actually have a second location in Los Angeles. DC4 is located at my company's headquarters in New York City. DC6 is on the other side of the North American continent in Los Angeles. Therefore, it is not in the right location. So what we need to do is go through and create an additional site for my Los Angeles domain controller DC3. So I'm going to come up here to Sites, right-click and say New Site. Let's call it LA for Los Angeles. Now notice that when we define additional sites, we have to define which link is used to connect those two sites together. This is called the site link. Now these site links need to be configured to reflect the actual WAN infrastructure that connects these two sites. And you'll note here that a link is being automatically created called default IP site link that will connect the New York and LA sites. I'll click OK. And it tells me that the LA site has been created. And then it gives me a couple of additional tasks we need to complete. First of all, we need to ensure that LA is linked to the other sites where appropriate. I don't have any other sites in this demo, just LA and New York City, so we don't have to worry about that one. Then we need to add our subnets for the LA site. And then we need to install the domain controllers that exist in LA into the appropriate container within that site as well. Let's click OK. So now we have LA. If I expand LA, you'll note that there is a servers container here, but nothing is in it. We need to move DC6 from New York City to LA. So let's select DC6, right-click on it, and click on Move, and then specify that we're going to move it to LA. Click OK. So now we have DC4 in New York City and DC6 in Los Angeles. The next thing we need to do is configure our subnets. Now this is very, very important because Active Directory will identify which computers are located in which of these two sites based upon the IP address assigned to that computer. Really, the purpose of sites is twofold. First is to make sure that users are always directed to local resources. For example, let's suppose I am using a Windows client workstation. I'm booting it up. I'm located in New York City. I need to authenticate to my domain. Well, that authentication request should be sent to the closest domain controller, which in this case would be DC4. Could I authenticate using a domain controller in Los Angeles? Yeah. Would it be dumb to do it that way? Yeah. How come? Because my authentication traffic would have to go clear across the country, authenticate on the domain controller over here, and have that information sent back. If for one system, that's not a big deal. But imagine if this is a big company and I've got, say, 350 people who all come in between 8 and 8:30. They're sending all this authentication traffic to the other side of the continent just to log into their workstations. That's dumb. Instead, it would be better to redirect that authentication to a local domain controller that's located probably inside my same building. It'll be a lot faster, and we don't tie up any bandwidth on our WAN with simple authentication traffic. And by doing this, we can reserve the bandwidth associated with the WAN for important WAN traffic, not for authentication. The other thing that sites do is allow us to control replication. Notice that we have a server on both sides of the continent. These two servers have to remain consistent. If I create a new user on DC4, that same user account needs to show up eventually over here on DC6. If I set up group policy on DC6, those group policies need to also become available on DC4 as well. You can use these sites to control replication between these two servers. For example, you can configure when that replication should occur. By and large, you want that replication to occur when not a lot of other things are going on. For example, we're probably not going to run replication between 8 and 9 in the morning when everybody's first getting into work and logging on. So we've got our servers in the appropriate sites. Now we need to create those subnets that will identify which IP address ranges are located with each site. Now, if I go up to my subnets container, you'll note that I don't have any subnets currently defined. We need to fix this. So I need to create one subnet for New York City and one subnet for LA. I'll right-click on subnets, click on new subnet. Now I need to enter in the actual IP subnet address for each of these sites. For example, let's create one for New York City. Now note up here you can define your subnet in terms of IPv4 or IPv6. We're going to just use IPv4 in this example. The subnet for my New York site is 10.0.0.0/24. 24 indicates a subnet mask of 255.255.255. So with this address, this much is network, this much is node. Any host whose IP address is in the 10.0.0.0 range, I know is part of the New York subnet. So I'll mark NYC down here, click OK. Now I need to do the same thing, but for my LA site. So I'm going to go back up to subnets, right click, and then click on new subnet. Now the network address used in LA is different. We're still using a 24-bit subnet mask. This is a completely different subnet. We're on 10.0.1.0 instead of 10.0.0 as we were in New York City. We'll associate that with LA. Therefore, anytime Active Directory sees a host with an IP address that begins with 10.0.1, it knows that it's part of the LA site. The last thing we need to do is configure our InterSitesTransport. These are our site links that we talked about just a minute ago. If I click on InterSitesTransports and I go to IP, here's the default IP site link that we use to link New York City to Los Angeles. I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to rename this because default site IP link is not helpful. Let's name this NYC to LA IP site link. That tells me exactly how this link is configured. This is the IP link between New York City and LA. I'm going to right click on it and go to properties. And here I can configure various parameters. First of all, sites that are connected by this link. Right now it's just the two, LA and New York City. Down here, I can configure replication. How often do I want replication to occur? Right now it's set to 180 minutes. And here I can configure the replication schedule. As I said earlier, I want to avoid replication between about 8 and 9 in the morning because that's when everybody's coming, they're logging on, and there's a lot of demand on the domain controller. So I want to run replication any other time but that. And I'm really only concerned about it Monday through Friday because nobody's at work Saturday and Sunday. So I'm going to use this schedule to kind of block out the 8 till 10 o'clock hours on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Any other time, replicate away. I don't care. Click OK. That's it for this demonstration. In this demo, we talked about how to configure sites. First, we learned how to create sites. We learned how to move servers around between sites. Then we learned how to create subnets to identify a site, and we ended this lesson by talking about how to manage InterSite transports, our site links.